European History with Dr. Brovkin, AP European History with Dr. Brovkin. Today's topic is Reformation. Reformation is one of the most important events in European history. Obviously, it's a revolution in ideas, in religion, in politics, in social order, all kinds of things where 100 years of war is what triggered a Reformation. So we have to understand what happened and why. Now, we start with popular religion. When we talk about Reformation, what is being reformed? Usually the focus is on the official church and how it was restructured by Martin Luther and Calvin and others. But first we have to see the context, and the context is what people actually do. How did they practice their religion on the eve of Reformation, which is the time of Renaissance, which is the 1400s and early 1500s. You know, one thing that is so obvious at this time is, of course, the sales of indulgences, which is sale of forgiveness, something that really pretty much upset both Savonarola and later Martin Luther. But also, it was a time of a cult of relics. And so people would go to the church and they would see a bone of some saint. Even today, when I go to European churches, you would see, oh, the greatest relic of this church is some finger of some priest or some saint or something. I mean, this craze started during the time of the Crusaders, when they were hunting for relics and the original cross of Jesus and the original cloth of Jesus. In fact, in Turin, one of the relics until quite recently was supposedly the cloth that covered Jesus's body. And then later on, a few years ago, it was discovered that it's a fake of the 10th century. In any case, the relics, the sale of indulgences, the pilgrimages and the festivals, this is what religious life looked like for most common people. And it also came together with paying dues to the church, and of course paying for the forgiveness of sins, which became big business in the 1400s. So the term is called simony, and that's buying and selling of church privileges, pardons, and benefices, which includes more than just forgiveness of sins. It also can include sale of jobs and positions and the blessings for the wedding or for the newborns and whatever. In other words, the church made money, and the church needed money. Especially needed money in the early 1500s because St. Peter's Cathedral was being built. And Pope, first it was Alexander, and then Julius, and then Leo. They all needed a lot of money until it was built. And of course, you know, this grand building with all these marble and huge spaces, it needed a ton of money to build. And this is what they used it for. So it is in this context that you have also, as we discussed earlier, kind of a loosening of morals, freedom of expression, and one other very important new situation that developed is the invention of the printing press. Gutenberg 1450s. So that made public discourse much easier. Books began to be published, and not only books but pamphlets and all kinds of ideas, which would make Luther's job much easier because now you had a printing press. So this is the context of the beginning of Reformation. But at that time it was just a matter of one other rebellious priest. So Savonarola is burned, done with, but then you have one other. And so that would mean we should focus on the life of Martin Luther. So Martin Luther is a German student when he began his political career. He was born in 1483, so the time of Lorenzo Medici. When he grows up, he goes to school. In 1501, he's a student at the University of Erfurt, and that also means that Germany is picking up. It probably had more universities already then than other countries. So Germany is entering the age of modern development with the development of cities and universities. So he's a university, and then something extraordinary happened in 1505, which is a very remarkable experience, similar to what Muhammad experienced. And that is, he's alone in the forest, and then there was a lightning, and then he had a revelation. He heard the voice that told him that he has to spread the word of Jesus. He was totally shaken by that experience, and he changed his life, changed the life of the world in many ways. He decided to devote himself to God, and he becomes a monk. And he joins the convent and begins to be a super obedient monk. He actually practices all these principles of being a monk, which is chastity, poverty, and obedience. The one that came hardest was obedience. He definitely deprived his flesh of pleasures, and he went to the extremes. Some reminiscences are that he used to walk barefoot in winter, and that he would sleep on snow, and he would try to do everything to the maximum of showing his devotion to the Christian vows of a monk. But the obedience part was difficult, because as he thought more and more about what it means to devote his life to Jesus, he began to realize that there are things he disagreed with. And then the more he thought about it, the more he disagreed. And obviously it had to do with the role of the Pope, with the selling of indulgences, and with basically the spreading of easygoing disbelief that people were forgetting Christ, and just he had a hard time. So he went to his superior and he said, I have sinful thoughts, Father. I can't live with this. And the father would say, oh, you're forgiven, you're forgiven, you're forgiven. Just forget about it. Don't think about it. Go back into your life and be a good monk. And he would do that, and he's forgiven. And then sometime later he would come against his father. I have sinful thoughts against the church. Oh my God, you're forgiven, forgiven, forgiven. Anyway, it just didn't work. He had more and more of these critical thoughts. The crucial event was in 1510, when he was included in a pilgrimage from Germany to Italy, to Rome. Pilgrimage means a procession. So they walked on foot across the Alps to Rome, which was a tradition of pilgrimages that goes back to the Middle Ages. So he comes to Rome. Martin Luther comes to Rome, 1510. He was stunned. It was awesome. He just couldn't believe his eyes. His first impression was this absolutely unbelievable. All these churches and the new cathedral and all these people and activities, and it's like Vatican with all these hundreds of priests from all over Europe. It was absolutely overwhelming. And the paintings and the new churches and the new everything. It was absolutely incredible. He was totally overwhelmed. And then he went back and he started thinking about it. And the more he thought about what he saw in Rome, the more he felt something, a protest rising in him. And he had more and more doubts. So he goes to his supervisor and says, I can't live with this any longer. And his supervisor says, look, if you have all these thoughts about religion and about the meaning of the scripture, the Bible, why don't you start talking about it and teaching it? And he got a job as a university professor to discuss theology, to discuss the meaning of the Bible. So he began reading it even more and then talking to his students. And so this is his intellectual development. So let me put it this way. The most important question that Martin Luther was obsessed with all his life is a very simple one. How do you save your soul? That's the question for him. And his answer is, by scripture, by faith alone. In a sense, this is the whole meaning of Lutheranism. You will be saved by faith alone. That means not by good deeds. That means not by buying indulgences, not by listening to the Pope. In a sense, by coming to the conclusion that your soul will be saved by faith alone. he kind of summarized, and everything else was a follow-up, a consequence, a logical conclusion from that premise. The logical conclusion were revolutionary. You don't actually need the Pope to be a good Christian. Sounds very logical, but it's totally counter-revolutionary. I mean, this is not the way the church was supposed to be. You don't need the Pope. You don't need the priests. You don't even need the church. All you need is belief, is your faith in God, Jesus Christ. This is what he came to the conclusion. And then if you ask, what about the Pope? The more he thought about the Pope, the more he was angry, not only at the current Pope, but as a papacy, as an institution. And he called it all kinds of names in his later writings, including that the Pope is a prostitute and the church is a gang of thieves, similar to Savonarola. It was absolutely total condemnation of the existing church of his time, and of the Pope, and of the papacy, and of the relics, and of all kinds of rituals that the church practiced. So it was essentially a rebellion. The most important event here is that in 1519 he comes to his church where he did the sermons, and nailed to the door of the church 95 theses, 95 points, and they're widely available. You could just put 95 theses on in the internet search and it'll come up. I just did, and read them again, and the thing that comes through very clearly is this key idea: you will be saved by faith alone, and there's no need for papacy, and there's no need for indulgences. And just goes on and on and on about the corruption of the church and about what is wrong with the way it is established. No need of Pope, no need of rituals, no need of indulgences. Stop the corruption of the church, and no need of church oligarchy and church hierarchy. Essentially, he introduces a totally new idea. You can believe in God on your own. In many ways, it's a continuation of what Savonarola believed, in that it is your faith alone that matters. It is your direct relationship with God that is the key to faith, and not any church or any institutions that were created. So the revolutionary thing happens. What didn't happen with Savonarola is that nobody heard Savonarola except people in the church. Here comes Gutenberg. His sermons are published immediately. It's like internet today. The students pick them up and publish them, and within a matter of months, all of Germany knew about Martin Luther and about 95 Theses. So this is the new factor that promoted the communications revolution, the invention of the printing press that made ideas spread quickly. To his astonishment, he discovered he had a whole lot of supporters. It's just a whole lot of supporters, first of all among students, and then among sympathizers among the aristocracy. And as he was going to find out, even the kings and dukes and all kinds of aristocrats and educated people began to support his ideas. But not the Pope. So in 1519, he attacked the Pope. He called him a whore, and the institution totally corrupt and unchristian. And the payback comes in 1520. Leo excommunicates him from the Catholic Church. But it's not so simple. Alexander excommunicated Savonarola, and then they burned him on the stake. Not so easy this time. Because of his supporters, and particularly the King of Saxony, his supporters demand that he could not be just excommunicated. There should be a trial, and the Pope has to agree. And so here comes an incredibly important historical event, which is called the Diet of Worms. Worms is a city in Germany, and Diet means an assembly of nobles. of kings and dukes and others who ruled Germany. And actually, Germany is a part of the Holy Roman Empire that includes Italy. And there are two important persons in this diet, or any diet for that matter, in the assembly of German princes. It's the emperor and the pope. And that has been like this for centuries. So the emperor at that time has been recently elected in 1517. I call him Don Carlos. He is a young man, he's 18, he's got red hair, and he's probably the richest man in Europe because he's a Habsburg, and as a Habsburg, he's elected to be the Holy Emperor, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, that includes a chunk of France and Low Countries and Germany and Italy as a Holy Roman Empire. And then you have the Pope. So these two and a whole bunch of German princes assemble in Worms for the purpose of the trial of Martin Luther, and he is there too. So this is a moment of his incredible courage and his stamina, his determination. Can you imagine? He's standing there, and all around him are all the most powerful men of Europe, all the kings and dukes and duchesses and the Pope himself and the Emperor himself. And the Pope says, "Are you ready to recant?" Which means to refuse your heresy. You're a heretic. And he refuses to do so. Says, "No, I believe by everything that I said." So he basically signs himself a death sentence. The next thing is going to happen, is supposed to happen, is he's going to be arrested and burnt, like Savonarola did. Not so easy this time around. When the diet is over, everybody assumes he's going to be now arrested, but he's not, because he has powerful supporters, and among them the Duke, the King of Saxony. So as the diet is over and he leaves, he's kidnapped. He didn't know anything about it. He literally is kidnapped. There's just a bunch of men who took him, put him in a carriage, and took him in, I think it's Warburg, which is a German castle. The kidnapping was actually his salvation, because if he hadn't been kidnapped, he would have been arrested and burned, killed. But the person who did it was his patron, his secret admirer, the King of Saxony, and he is put in a castle in safety, and he's completely alone. He's very miserable actually in this castle, but he has time, and he begins to write. And the most important thing that he wrote is called the German Bible. So he translates the New Testament into German language, and that becomes his life achievement. This becomes his most important work, because that is basically makes the Bible available to the masses of German people, because only educated people knew Latin, and only very educated people could read the Bible and understand what it says. So by translating the Bible, it creates a kind of an intellectual religious revolution by making the ideas of Jesus, which is the Bible is description of Jesus' lives by his apostles, available to the people for the first time. And that, of course, creates a totally new situation and new freedom. The consequences of the publication of the Bible and of his preaching were absolutely devastating for Europe. This would mean that the Catholic Church would be split, that there would be a new Lutheran Church would be created in Germany. Germany would be forever split into two parts, the Catholic part and the Protestant one, which would be called Lutheran. He would have even more followers, such as Calvin and Zwingli and others, and they would create their own churches, and there would be 100 years war, 100 years of religious war that would shake up Europe beyond foundation. The most bloody one would be in France, and it would touch even Britain, and there will be British Reformation on its own version of it. In other words, it was absolutely catastrophic from the point of view of civil peace, but incredibly important intellectual and religious consequences of basically the life and work of one man, Martin Luther. Thank you.